to have an opportunity to come out to your lab and to see exactly what you do when you talk about paper conservation.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's nice that you're here, and I hope that I can be informative and so forth.
Now, there's a couple of things that we sort of want to get straightened around here as to what actually do you do for paper conservation? I mean, we sort of need to know that, and we also want to talk a little bit about how people who maybe have something that they're concerned about, maybe what they should be doing. So maybe we should start out, and you can talk exactly what your craft is.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm a professional paper conservator, and which means that I work with all kinds of paper materials, archival materials, fine art on paper, maps, archival materials, and books, restore books, do fine binding, and I have examples here. We'll probably talk about those a little bit later. And basically what I do is say, as far as books are concerned, everybody has a book an old Bible, for example, maybe the covers are coming off or the back is off, and they just want to have it repaired or partially restored. And lately, or just recently, I did the Bowron Bible. It belongs up in the Bowron Lakes area. It's a famous Bible. It belongs to the provincial government at the center there. And that I actually had to make a bid on. I had to go to Victoria and went through Heritage Sites branch of the government and looked at it and came up with what I thought it would cost me and make a little bit of profit. And what I did with that Bible, I took it completely apart, every page, and I dry cleaned it with eraser, and I washed it.
With an eraser?
With erasers. For example, here's an eraser here. This is a magic rub eraser.
Just an ordinary eraser, then?
Well, no, it's not ordinary. This is a very good. This is the best eraser you can buy. It has very little. It's not very abrasive, so it doesn't do much damage to the paper. But that's the first step: is to sort of clean the paper, and then wash it in lukewarm water. And that's what that large sink over there is for. And then I deacidify it. I soak it in an alkaline solution, and also that's what that container there is. That's the magnesium bicarbonate solution, and soak in that for about 40 minutes, and that neutralizes all the acid in the paper.
Now, when I buy a book that's very smelly, is that what you're getting rid of then?
Well, it might be, or it could be mold that you're talking about, or it could be a acidic condition. But then, after it's washed, then it's sort of neutral, and it's also above neutral. It's got a pH about 8.5, and it also leaves some of this carbonate in the paper to neutralize future acid that might form. And then the book is mended if there are any tears in it. Then it's re-sewn on the sewing frame like we have over here. And then the book is rounded and backed, new end sheets. And then the cover, then I restored the cover, put it in.
Okay, show me one of these.
Here's a book here. It's something like this. Is my own Bible, family Bible. It's a Danish Bible, and it's actually in Danish. And my family's all listed in here. But anyway, this was the boards. This is called the board, front board, back board. They were off the book. So what I did, I lifted the leather here and lifted the leather there and put in a new piece of leather, and then did some mending of the pages. I didn't wash this. It was pretty good. Had a pH.
Wouldn't you be careful or be cautious of that, because you mentioned that your family is listed in there. That would be ink that would then run, wouldn't it?
That's right. Well, in a section like that, you wouldn't put that in water. But I have here's the old brand family, but I have a different kind of deacidifier called Whito, and I can just spray it, and it's mostly alcohol and evaporates almost instantly. So you don't get any bleeding of the inks. So that part I would do differently. And then I put the back on, mended the corners. And so roughly that's what I did with the Bowron Bible to restore it. And so it went back to Barkerville, and it's on display. And I gave them instructions on how to then to display it, what kind of a condition, what humidity, temperature, so that it will last. You can do all this work on a precious book and put it back in a bad environment, and the same thing will happen in a few years again. So temperature and humidity are extremely important.
Well, I mentioned to you before when we were preparing for the show, I have a friend who has an old family Bible. and she's put it in a box and put it in a cupboard. Now, how does that sound to you as a conservator?
Well, not so good. I'll tell you why. Because when you put a book in a box like that, this is the type of a box. This is for a fine binding, and this isn't a bad type of box if you're going to put a book on a shelf because it protects it. And I don't want to change the subject. This is another kind of a slip case, and that can be rather destructive to a book because every time you put it in, you tend to abrade it. But your friend who has this book and put it in the box in the cupboard, well, what you do when you close the box up, you create sort of a microclimate. And say if there's a lot of moisture on the day she puts it in the box, that moisture is going to remain there. And it may be too excessive moisture. And when there's a lot of moisture and a lot of heat, then we get what we call hydrolysis, acid catalyzed hydrolysis, and which means that the acid in the paper attacks the fiber, and the more the moisture is there, the easier it's going to do that. The higher the temperature, the faster it's going to do that. So if you put a book in a container like that, you may be creating such an atmosphere or environment that this catalyst acid hydrolysis is going to take place. So probably the best thing to do with a book like that is to put it out in the open and just to expose it, and so you get some circulation around it. And again, if you put something in a closed container, that's where mold starts forming, because mold or fungi doesn't like moving air, it likes stagnant air. So it's good to get it out in the open where you get some movement of air.
So now, Charles, she's concerned, I think, that if she puts this book out, that somebody is going to handle it and touch it and destroy it more, and yet you're saying it should be outward and get into the air.
That's right. Well, I think she just has to instruct her friends. This is a valuable book, and don't handle it. And some people, she will be probably she won't mind if they handle it, but she just have to give some instruction on how it's to be cared for.
I haven't seen the book, and I'm really curious, but she's so protective of this book that she won't let anybody touch it or anybody look at it. And I keep thinking to myself, if I had a book that was so interesting, I would want that out. I mean, it's a wonderful conversation piece.
Sure it is. And again, if it's that valuable, excuse me, I just have here some, these are gloves that oftentimes I will use those if I'm handling something that's quite precious. And the purpose of the glove is just so that you don't get oil from your hands onto the document you're touching. Especially,
well, we use them in the museum for the archives.
That's right. So, if she's really fussy about that, well, she could say, well, would you put on these white gloves and handle it gently? And a book may need some work on it, too, if she's so concerned. Maybe the boards are off and she's concerned with that.
I have this feeling, and I think there are a lot of books out in the valley like that people have. Not necessarily even family Bibles, but old books that have been mishandled.
For example, here's a good example. This belongs to some people in Comox. They called me up the other day. It's a little book on Robbie Burns. It's a beautiful little book. When I got it, both boards were off, and this leather back spine leather was off, and many of the pages were torn. And so what I did, I mended the pages first, and then put in a new piece of cloth, and put the old back on again, and mended the corners. So now it's functional. You see, now it can be handled. Before, it couldn't. I put in a hollow back, and that tends to throw the book up a little bit, you see, rather than keeping it down like that when you open it. So that's an example of somebody in the Courtenay-Comox Valley that had a book, and there are lots of these books around.
And they're real treasures.
That's right, they are, yes.
I think we tend to look in terms of the family silver or those kind of items as being treasures, but I believe now there's a change where we're seeing the art treasure that these books are, and you were saying that you really enjoy restoring artwork itself.
I do, yes.
Because a lot of them have been damaged either through being in a cupboard because somebody didn't like that particular one.
Well, speaking especially of prints, I have prints, as you see, all around the lab here. And what I do when I hang them out of the strong light so they're not exposed to the sun. If you have a work of art on paper, a print, or a lithograph or something like that, and you hang it so it's exposed to the sunlight, in just a very few weeks or months, it'll begin to degrade. And so it's important to realize that light can be very damaging, as well as excessive heat and moisture. And like you say, people handling also can be damaging to paper artifacts.
You know, we take a print and we put it behind glass. Is that good or bad?
No, that's fine because there's a little air usually coming in from the back. And primarily the reason we mat a work of art, if we didn't, like, people would probably come along and touch it. It's protective. But there's also a museum mounting board window mat that protects it from the glass. Now, if you put that glass right against the print, that would be could be very destructive because moisture can form and condense in the glass, and then it transfers then to the print.
If this, as you're talking, I'm thinking in my mind, you know, about what we do in our home that actually can be very bad for the things that we
That's
have.
right.
So,
Hey, well, what you're touching on is probably the most important aspect of conservation, and we call it preventive conservation. It's something that anybody can do, not only for library works of art, but for the environment too. Maybe we can get into that a little bit later on preventive conservation. But a lot of people or institutions will spend a lot of money getting one little item restored and using all their budget, you know, for that. And what they really should be spending that money on would be to perhaps security for their institution, good locks, good security system, alarm system, maybe protecting the windows so not excessive light isn't coming in to do damage, good storage facilities, you know, good drawers to store their materials in, proper humidity, not over 50%, plus or minus about 3%, and temperature not in excess of around 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees centigrade. And if you have these good environmental conditions, then your works are going to last. And that's the best way to use your money. Of course, you're going to put the conservators out of business if you do that.
there are always things for conservatives to do because there's always something that you find new or something that is damaged for whatever reason. You know, and actually when you're talking about this, it just occurs to me, people tend to roll up maps, I should say.
That's right.
And how do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's a real problem, especially some of the big museums. They have these huge maps, and so they roll them up and they stand them in the corner. And when I went to the, I think it's the British Museum, went into the map room there, and what they had done, some previous curator had done, had actually, these big maps, they'd actually cut them up into sections so they would fit into the drawers. Now that's a terrible thing to do.
I'm just horrified.
Yeah, so the really fine, best thing to do is to somehow store them flat in map folders, and which means that you have to have fairly large. I have a series of drawers here for big map folders, and they're about 4 feet long and about 3 feet deep, and it's ideal. But there are maps that are larger than that, of course. And when I was at the Provincial Archives in Winnipeg, what we did, we had some really fine maps there. And we worked out on 2 of the big map cases on top, put 2 of them together. So we had a surface of about 15 feet by about 8 feet. And so then we would take the maps and we encapsulate them in Mylar, and then we would just store them flat on top of this map cabinet. And that was the ideal storage for them. And if you wanted to handle them, you could slide them off onto another surface, but they were flat, and that's the best way. And maps that have been rolled can be flattened by putting them into a humidity chamber to relax them and then to flatten them.
Because actually some of the old maps can be extremely interesting, particularly when we're talking about the new territories of Canada as they opened up, and we can see the change that occurred.
That's right. You know, just recently I restored a big map, again for the provincial government through heritage sites, for Cache Creek, for the, what's the big, can't think of it, there's a big ranch just above.
Not the O'Keefe.
No, not the O'Keefe. It'll come to me, but anyway, it's a working ranch, and they get thousands of visitors through their Hat Creek Ranch, it's called, about
Right.
8 miles north of Cache Creek. And it was a map that was 9 feet long and 5 feet wide. And what I had to do, I had to rearrange these tables so I had enough space. I put this one side by side, or I turned these around, and then I took the old backing off and put on a new linen backing, and deacidified it and mended it. And then I actually then delivered it to Hat Creek. And they have it hanging just in what was the old kind of a saloon where people would come in and they'd sort of relax for a while and have a drink, but it's along that wall there. So that was and this was 1902. It was Dominion map of Canada. Quite a valuable map, I would say.
I would think so.
Yeah.
That must have been exciting to work on something like that when it's like a challenge.
Oh, yes, it was. It's the largest map that I had ever done. I've done some for special collections for UBC and Yandel, but none that large before.
What is the oldest item that you've worked on?
Well, I guess some of the early printed books, you know, we call the period from the invention of printing by Gutenberg. We think he printed his Bible. He came up with what he called movable type.
Mm-hmm.
And we had printing before that, like the Chinese would actually carve out their letters, but once they were carved, they couldn't move the letters around.
Mm-hmm.
And so Gutenberg's genius was that he had movable type. He would cast them in metal. Then he could set up a page, and then if there were any mistakes, then he could correct them. He could take out the type and put in something else.
Mm-hmm.
So he printed what we call a Gutenberg Bible in about 1449. And that period from 1449 till the end of that century, 1500, is called, anything printed in that period is called an incunable, or an incunabulum. And incunabulum means a cradle of printing.
The
And
beginning.
It's a beginning. And then later people used that word incunable to identify a book that was printed during that 500, is that 500 years? Yeah. 50 years. 50, sorry.
50, yeah.
50 years. So that 50 years is
Mhm.
kind of, it's called a period of,
But he must have been very prolific in what he did, because you said there are so many of these books.
oh no, all he did was, he just did the immovable type.
Mm-hmm.
And that really was sort of the start then of
Mhm.
printing. And then it took hold in Italy and other parts of Europe, and they began to use type, you know, a movable
Mhm.
type to print books with. Before that time, everything was done with calligraphy. Like the
Mhm.
monks would do these manuscripts.
That's right.
with
They're
ink.
beautiful.
They are.
Works of art.
And so the first typefaces, you know, like this is called a typeface,
Mhm.
the way that there are many different typefaces. And the faces were made to resemble this early calligraphy, because people didn't want to buy something completely new. They wanted to look like the old. So anyway, there was this period of 50 years. So I've done some restoration of incunables, you know, a few, maybe half a dozen or so. Every rare book collection in Canada, university level, has a few maybe of these incunable, these very early printed books. So those would probably be the earliest. When I was in Germany, I studied for a time at the Staatsbibliothek in Munich. And, well, now to think about it then, I did treat a couple books that were even older than that they had in their collection, and taking them apart and washing them and so forth. That was under the supervision of a good Meisterbinder. So I didn't really do it on my own, but I did
Yeah,
it.
you handled them.
I handled them, yes.
Mhm.
But I did see a lot of, in fact, when I was there, I saw some, you know, 9th century books that they had in their collection.
Really exciting.
It is, yes. But so I suppose that's probably maybe the earliest things that I've done there.
So you actually studied in Germany then to learn your craft?
That's right. You know, I was at the Hermitage here and working, and I would keep getting requests for books that had really valuable prints and paper, and I wanted to learn something about that. So I talked to Remy, my bishop, and my director, and so I went to the New England Document Center in Massachusetts and worked with Dr. Cunha there for about a year. And while I was there, I did a lot of what we call it flat paperwork. They said, if you come and if you'll do bookbinding for us, we'll teach you paper conservation. So that was the beginning. So then I thought, well, after that time, I really wanted to learn more. So Cunha arranged for me to go to Europe. What I mean, I wrote and he wrote. So I was accepted in a number of places, like in Ascona in Switzerland, and Vienna, at the Academy, and then Munich at the Staatsbibliothek, the British Museum, and then in Madrid. So I worked in all these places for about a year, for a space of a couple months or so. I picked up a lot of knowledge. And then while I was there, and I'm still a hermit, you know, and while I was there, I received a letter, a telephone call from the National Museums of Canada that Canadian Conservation Institute, and I'm sure you're acquainted with that. And they have headquarters in Ottawa, and they were going to set up 5 regional centers. In fact, there was a regional center in Vancouver that closed down. Barry Byers was there. He's now a paper conservator at the Provincial Archives in Victoria. So I had this telephone call, would you like to work for the Canadian Conservation Institute? You know, never dreamed that I'd be doing, I just wanted to learn something about paper.
And it snowballed.
That's right. So they flew me back to Ottawa, all expenses paid, and then they paid me for 2 weeks, $200 a day, just to, you know, to see their sites. And then they flew me to Moncton, New Brunswick, where they had a provincial center. And so then I was hired as a paper conservator. And then they flew me back to Europe, and I did 4 more months of work there they gave me, they paid for that actually. And then I came back and I started to work for the Canadian Conservation Institute, doing books and works of art and archival materials. So that was a really valuable experience.
Oh, I guess
I hadn't
so.
planned on that.
It sort of all worked out.
And then I just gradually worked myself back. And then that center closed. And then I went to Ottawa, which was the center for the Canadian Conservation Institute. And then I was there just for a little while, and there was a job opening in Winnipeg to set up a lab for the provincial government. I did that. So I just gradually then I worked myself back, and then came back and I set up this paper lab here, part of my hermitage.
Yeah. What an incredible background, though. I mean, when I say to people that you know what you're doing, now they'll understand that because they'll have heard it from you that, you know, just what your background is.
Certainly, you know, I think a lot of it is being exposed to other people's works and to being exposed to other cultures and institutes where this work is done. And that's really invaluable experience to have that kind of exposure.
So, I mean, there are a lot of bookbinders around, but they aren't paper conservators, and that in itself is a unique
It is. I think so. I think that that was my feeling that, I was a competent bookbinder, but I really wasn't very conversive with the treatment of paper itself and inks and colors and so forth. And I felt I really had to learn about that. And I never was looking for a job. It was just a matter of, it's how you naturally learn, I think, in life. You don't set out to do that kind of a thing, but it sort of presents itself, and if you're open to it, why, you can benefit from such an exposure.
That's right. Whoever knew that I'd end up doing television interviews? That sort of evolved as well.
Sure, yeah.
You know,
with your interest in sociology and people and crafts and so forth, it's just kind of a natural evolution, huh?
That's right. That's right. I want you to tell our viewers how this paper is created, because I found that fascinating. I thought it was printed, but you tell me that this is not printed.
Yeah, well, this is what we call marble paper, and its use is on books, on the outside of books, or maybe sometimes the end sheets within a book itself. And these are handmade papers, and these are very famous papers. They were done by Cockerell, Sidney Cockerell, and his father is Douglas Cockerell in England, about 1980, 1990, one of the first really great bookbinders and conservation binders. There's a difference between a bookbinder and a conservation binder. But he was one of the first conservation binders. And then his son later set up a studio in Cambridge, and he's developed these beautiful, I have a whole selection of these hand marble papers. And how it's done, how I would do it here, would take a photographic tray, a large photographic tray, and fill it maybe halfway full with water. And then you take various printer's inks, and you just sort of squeeze them on the water. You take a stick and you make a pattern with these inks. And then you take just a piece of paper that's been sized, and you lay it face down on that mixture of inks, and you lift it off. So you get one print, and that's what the print is like. Now this one in England by Cockerell, or whoever is doing it for Cockerell, had a much more mechanized way of doing it, but basically it was the same. He had a tank of water, and he had a sort of a roller system that would go down with little sticks, and that would form the pattern, and he'd come across this way. So he'd get the pattern, and then he'd put the paper down. And his were, everyone is different, but they're sort of similar, because there's a little bit of mechanism in his way of doing it.
we have come to the end of our time, and we haven't even, I know, covered the whole topic. Charles, I want to thank you for allowing us into your studio and giving us this opportunity to see what you do for paper conservation.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and it's good to see. I just like to put in a word for the Court Museum. I know you're connected with that. You're one of the trustees. In fact, I think you're the chairman of the Board of Trustees. And I have a great feeling that it's going now in the right direction. And of course, I'm very keen on museums because I've worked a lot with them in the past. So it's good to have you here.
Good, thank you. Thank you all for watching Hunt for History. Bye for now.